Today we are here to discuss a short story written by Kurt Vonnegut, and it's entitled Harrison Bergeron. Vonnegut was a very well-known writer of the second half of the 20th century. He died in 2007, and he was born in 1922. He attended university at Cornell, and he came from a family of scientists, and that's kind of important for many of his science fiction writing later on. But he left to join the army, was captured in the Battle of Bulge, and sent to a prison in Dresden, where, of course, he witnessed and experienced the firebombing of the entire city. And it's that experience which is the basis of his most famous novel, Slaughterhouse-Five. Slaughterhouse-Five was the prison in which he found himself in Dresden. And then he came back, and shortly thereafter, after attending University of Chicago, he became full-time writer. And I think his writing is original, inventive, and also quite funny. And Amy, maybe you could give us a little summary of the short story to get us started.
This satirical work of science fiction takes place in America in 2081, when everyone is finally equal, not just before the law or before God, but equal every which way. Because human beings are not created equal, it is the work of the government to make them so. Thanks to the intrusive and leveling efforts of the United States Handicapper General, no one is smarter, stronger, swifter, or more beautiful than anyone else. The thinking of smart people, for example, is regularly interrupted with dreadful noises going off in their heads. Beautiful and graceful ballerinas must wear hideous masks and dance with great heavy weights. Harrison Bergeron, a 14-year-old boy of superior brain, beauty, swiftness, and brawn, is in jail suspected of plotting to overthrow the government. As his parents, George and Hazel Bergeron, he slightly or above normal, wears a handicap. She is normal and thus mentally slow and wears no handicaps. As they watch handicap dancing on television, Harrison, having escaped from jail, enters the television studio and declares himself emperor. He sheds his prodigious handicaps and appears like a god. He selects his empress from among the ballerinas, instructs the musicians to play their best, and with his gorgeous counterpart at his side, he dances gracefully and beautifully up to the 30-foot ceiling, their love defying even the laws of gravity and motion. The handicapper general arrives to shoot them down. Hazel, witnessing her son's death on TV, is briefly sad, but as the sound of a gun goes off in his head, George says to her, don't be sad, forget about being sad, and so they do.
I thought I'd begin with a simple and direct question, and that's, would you like to live in the America of 2081 that's described in this story?
No.
No.
Every good and worthy thing is missing from it. There's no aspiration, there's no excellence, there's no love, there's no family. I mean, at the end, you see a kind of destruction of the family. Every good thing other than a certain kind of equality.
There's no joy, there's no memory, there's no real civic life in any sense.
Well, I suppose you could say there seems to be no crime or violence other than that comes from the right. Handicapper general.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to disagree with you, but let's at least mention a few things. I mean, there are no people worse off than anybody else. There is no envy. There is no resentment. There is a kind of, yes, there's a tiny amount of envy. She envies the people.
No.
Hold on. There's fundamental, compared to our society, virtually no envy, no resentment. People seem to be content with their lot. They have a kind view of the people who struggle with their handicaps to do their best. And
Hazel
there
does.
seems to be a kind of civic peace, admittedly achieved by sacrificing almost everything else that you'd want civic peace for. But this is a society which has rooted out all unfairness.
But does that mean that you would like to live in that
No,
society?
no, no. I would not want to live in that society, but I can imagine that there would be some people who would exchange this society for that one because of the things that I've mentioned. A certain kind of low level of contentment, a certain kind of civic peace and order, and no reason to feel bad about yourself, no self-hatred,
But it's utterly
no lack of self-esteem.
dehumanized.
I'm not sure the people living in the society would recognize it as being dehumanized. There might be a kind of very low level, to us, dehumanized way of living.
I actually think that's wrong in terms of the story itself. Yes, a kind of civic peace, but I don't think that this is a society without envy. In fact, this is a society that is founded upon envy as a political principle. And even though it's founded on that as a principle, the people that it's supposed to benefit still feel envy. So the first thing that's really said about Hazel is that she's envious of the interesting noises that are going off in her husband's head.
A little bit envious.
Yes,
Not
but
much.
in other words, even when you have done everything to try to do away with these natural inequalities, that kernel of envy still remains.
Yeah, but she says to him, look, I wouldn't mind if you're better than me. Just take off these weights. I wouldn't mind if I was not equal to you for a little while. That's
Right,
not...
and he says we can't do that so that we don't go back to the bad old days. So that even, in other words, this is a regime that is supposed to be calibrated to Hazel and her sort of wishes and desires. And it seems to me she herself is not satisfied with this order.
I think
But
that's-
she's not, you can't say that she's actively dissatisfied.
Well,
She's a
no,
little bit
she's not
sad.
capable of much, but even her aspirations, she says, I think I'd make a pretty good handicapper general.
Yes.
And he says, yes, you would, because you are like
no better than anyone else.
no better than anybody
Worse than
else.
anybody else.
Yeah, I basically agree with where both of you started. But look, Americans from the beginning are taught to embrace the view that no one is better than anyone else, at least in certain respects. We don't live in a world in which some people are by nature fit to rule over us. And we are rather proud of our sense of equal self-worth. And this is a society which has enabled people to feel no worse than anybody else, admittedly by making everybody worse.
But we're also a society that seems to esteem a certain kind of excellence.
To be sure. No, it wouldn't be interesting, and the whole conceit wouldn't be interesting if it didn't somehow speak to certain things that attract many Americans a lot of the time, and probably all Americans at least some of the time.
Well, if we have equality, and Americans say we want to have equality, then why shouldn't we prize this? Is this the sort of equality that is consonant with American principles or not?
Well, if you take your bearings from the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, I suspect that it doesn't fit that idea. That idea seems to be coherent with a kind of political equality, but not the social equality that is enforced and insisted upon in this society.
And Vonnegut is quite aware of that distinction. The opening lines, he says, they weren't only equal before God and the law, which I take it would be the original founding understanding of equality. Instead, he says they were equal every which way. And the fact that it takes the 211th, 12th, and 13th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution in order to achieve this new form of equality seems to me to indicate the distance between the original principles and this distortion or perversion of those principles.
Well, I mean, just to be mischievous again, since I don't like one-sided unanimity, I mean, it took the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to, in fact, make good on the principle of equality in those other respects. So you could say, look, I mean, the ideal, created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's very good. Suppose somebody says, well, look, I've got a right to pursue happiness, but I don't have the opportunity to pursue happiness. So you say, all right, we'll provide you with minimum public education at public expense. We'll see that you're vaccinated and you get the minimum amount of health care, so you're not harmed by your lack of health. We'll even provide you with unemployment compensation if you cannot get a job. So we help improve your opportunity to seek happiness. Then it turns out that the real obstacle to your attaining happiness has to do with the fact that you don't have the internal gifts to have happiness in a big sense. And so somebody would say, look, this right to pursue happiness, to enjoy happiness, that's rather hollow, unless I really finally have the equipment to do so. And since you can't give me the equipment to make it equal to the rest in the race of life, let's not just level the playing field. Let's level the players. Let's eliminate the game. And we can all go about our business and watch handicap dancing on television.
That would seem to me to raise interesting questions about what is that internal equipment that might be necessary for happiness. And actually the things that are gone after here, these natural inequalities, I think you could argue that those in fact are not the foundation of happiness. In other words, it's not beauty that supplies happiness or smarts. It's not wealth that supplies happiness. That whatever those internal qualities are, those in fact are available to the average as well as the extraordinary. I mean, it would
the principle you set up might be a noble one, but let me challenge you. I'd say that equality of opportunity, even though you might bring people up to bring in the race, is really a soft name for inequality. Equality of opportunity means you start at a certain point. The race begins at a certain point, but then the race results in vastly different outcomes. And that seems to me would be the original meaning of equality. It's a kind of soft name for inequality. It's almost an aristocratic principle, I would say, or at least it allows for great differences. I'm not sure that all Americans accept that. A large number of people in Western societies are sliding slowly towards the other view, that it's the equality of result which is important. And I think that this is what this story in a way points to, that we at some point, slowly, but at some point, 200 amendments down the line, you're going to get there unless you realize the different character of those principles. And then not only the different character, because it's one thing to say it's yours by tradition, you would have to say why one is better than the other. That still remains. Just because it was the original one doesn't mean it's the good one.
Well, look, sorry, go ahead. Did you want to
No, I was just going to, in a way, restate that. I mean, in the original conception, equality is linked to liberty, and so long as you have liberty, you will have to accept a fair measure of inequality of result.
Well, look, I take your point, and I agree with it. But look, America is more than the Declaration of Independence. America is also the Puritans and the Mayflower Compact and the Christian tradition. And that gives rise to some view of justice as well as liberty, not just liberty for all, but justice for all. And then there is a whole other strand which is not so much political, but is sort of social cultural, which is the kind of love of equality that Tocqueville talks about. So,
But Tocqueville poses a rather stark alternative. You could have an equality that really lifts the human spirit, which is really consonant with or goes along with freedom.
right.
Or you can have an intrusive government, a benign bureaucracy or benign tyranny, if you push the kind of equality which seems not to go hand in hand with freedom.
I don't think this story is an accurate caricature, and it's really, I mean, it's in a way cartoonish in its presentation. We don't really get deep presentation of the characters, but as a cartoon, it's not the America we know today, for the most part. I mean, we still esteem excellence. We still resist the intrusiveness of government, but there is a way in which the slogan of equality and the banner of equality attracts many, many followers. What is the demand for social justice, if not the attempt to root out the invidious inequalities, the seemingly unmerited and unfair inequalities under which many of our fellow Americans suffer? And to that extent, I mean, I think there is a tension, really, between the love of freedom and the love of equality, even if to begin with, the kind of equality we were talking about was equal liberty.
Well, this does bring us then, I think, directly to the question of Harrison Bergeron himself. Do we, the readers, want him to succeed? And by succeed, I mean not just to throw off this oppressive order, but do we want him to be able to display his excellence or not? And also to get the most beautiful girl. He ends up with the most beautiful girl. Do we like seeing everything go to this person? Is that our idea of what's just or fair? And if we don't like that, if we secretly believe that that's unjust, then I think Leon's pointing to a real problem. Maybe we're not as devoted to this idea of liberty as we think.
What do you think? Do you cheer for him?
Well, I'd give him a couple of cheers. Yes. Harrison Bergeron seems to stand for the rule of the best in the name of excellence, and insofar as I esteem excellence, I would like him to succeed. I would like to watch beautiful ballet on television instead of handicapped ballet. And yet, there's an aspect of Harrison Bergeron which you certainly can't cheer for. What's the first thing that he says when he comes in? I am the emperor. And
you're all going to do exactly what I say.
And you're going to do exactly what I'm saying. And if you do that, you'll become a duke or an earl. So he plans to establish an equally intrusive kind of government, only it's going to be his rule. And that I object to, of course.
Well, I'm not sure it will be equally intrusive. I mean, it will be the reinstitution of aristocracy.
Well, even more than that, I think. It's not simply the best, but he's going to tell you. He seems to be directing what is the best.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Amy's formulation I like very much. Granting Diana what you said before, that the virtues of brains and beauty and brawn are not necessarily wisdom, justice, courage, moderation, and the like. Nevertheless, there's something grand about him. And you have a tiny clue as to what he stands for when he declares himself an emperor. And he jostles the musicians and says, play your best.
He plucks them up.
He jostles them, but he doesn't want mediocrity. And he will reward excellence. I don't, being an American, I'm not in favor of monarchy, never mind tyranny. And I'm not in favor of aristocracy. but I do admire excellence. And while I wish that he had come to the throne and liberated everybody else so that everybody could sort of pursue this, and he became out as a champion of freedom, nevertheless, I sort of cheer for him with at least 2 cheers. He and his partner defy the laws of gravity and dance to kiss the ceiling. In a way, that's not human excellence, that's supernatural, because real ballet depends upon gravity. I mean, you can't sort of try to escape to some other place. And the story seems to suggest you've either got everybody squashed down to the floor where gravity and where the state holds them even lower than gravity would, or the only possible alternative is this kind of inhuman escape. It seems to me the truth is somewhere close to the way we now live, where all of the full range of human possibilities are there, partly weighted down with cares and failure, but with the real opportunity for a human success.
Well, that's a very nice point. Your point is that while he, in some sense, instantiates a kind of excellence, it is a suprahuman excellence. So he is no more human than the people that are weighted down with birdshot.
Leon suggested an alternative that's not available in the story. You have a full enemy of this order, of the order of America 2081, in the form of Harrison, and then you have the order, and the two can't live together. So you either have to choose one order or the other. And from what I heard from your answers, you really didn't like either one. And we haven't seen the 2082 of his regime, but would you be happier in that one with the emperor and the empress, and the emperor getting everything and dictating? That doesn't sound so nice either.
Yeah, I agree. It doesn't sound very nice. And in fact, even if he does rule in the name of excellence, we have no idea whether he's wise or really virtuous.
He's only 14 years old. I mean, give him a break.
This is true.
You wouldn't be willing to accept this for the return of beauty and eros and
Thumos.
aspiration,
Right.
all of these things that come back into the world with Harrison.
So,
And then we could, eventually throw off that monarchy and reinstate the original Declaration. But it seems to me a step in the right
Diana,
direction.
I appreciate the artistic, romantic side of his soul, but there is no evidence that he's a wise person. And after all, as Leon said, he's 14 years old.
yeah, but look, Diana, your comment really is very interesting, because what you're really implying, and the story really is forcing us, I think, to think about this. Isn't there really a deep tension, not only between the love of equality and the love of liberty, ultimately, but isn't there a deep tension between the love of equality and the love of excellence? And that if you care about excellence, maybe you're sort of longing for some kind of aristocracy, which when you got the aristocracy, you'd want to overthrow again to produce a kind of democracy, which would then slide back down into this kind of low mediocrity in which we'd have to hope for some kind of, unless you want to say there's a third alternative that's not in the story, the defense of which we have to give, which is equality rightly understood with opportunity for excellence built in. I'm not so sure it's simply easy to do in our circumstances.
Do you think that our circumstances disallow for that kind of inclusion of both equality and excellence?
Or use other words, democracy and meritocracy.
Yeah.
Certainly that seems to be the founders tried to articulate a regime in an argument that democracy is the only true meritocracy.
But a lot of the meritocracy turns upon unmerited gifts. I mean, someone is born very, very talented, and intelligence in today's world is probably worth a lot more in the contest of life than it might once have been in a cognitive society. Some people are unmeritedly gifted with good parents. Or with good health and so on. And a lot of what we call meritocracy is, in fact, not squandering and making the most of things which you got not because you were worthy, but because you were lucky.
Well, do you have a right to your own talents? Do you own them individually? Or the fact that they have come in part by accident, does that mean that society has some claim over them, to divide them, to partial them out, or at will? So who owns this lucky accident? I think maybe rests at the heart of your question.
Well, there used to be a kind of understanding that these gifts came from God, and therefore that you had an obligation to use them well and to put them at the service of your fellow man. I mean, maybe we've lost some of that sort of sense.
Yeah. I mean, if the question is, who owns my body and its innate talents?
Yes. Right.
As between me and you, Jim, I own it. And as between me and the government, I own it. But I don't really own it in any sort of deeper sense. And I think what Diana says is true. If we had a greater humility about what it is that gives the people in this discussion a great advantage in life, we would not somehow puff ourselves up and say all the good things that have come to us are coming to us, but we would rather see these as carrying, among other things, an obligation to put these talents in the service of a more excellent and a more just society.
Well, this raises the question of whether these, let's say, these natural people with natural talents, what do they owe society, not only morally but legally? What do they owe, and how would you extract from them what they do owe? For example, does the great artist, does he really owe anything to his society, or how much or what? And even if he doesn't give what he should give by some religious idea, is it the right of society to take it from him? The only thing it seems that we take of these blessings is money. But what about these other things?
Well, at some point, we used to conscript people for national service. They took more than money. There are arguments that I don't myself favor, but that we ought to require of the young people some payback to their communities for the education and the privileges that have come from living amongst us. But that at least is an idea which says that you have privileges and rights and all kinds of benefits from living in the United States. You should give back. What would you say?
I do believe that people should give back, especially the very gifted people, whether they be athletes or whether their excellence is beauty or brawn or intelligence. And partly it has to do with the fact that they don't simply own themselves. They owe it to the fact that they live in a society that really nurtures and nourishes them. And why not then ask of them something in return?
But I guess I'm not quite sure what we mean by giving back. I guess I would say that by virtue of having the talent and displaying the talent and using the talent, that itself is the giving back. I mean, that is the sharing
I would
of
agree
it.
with that. I would agree with that. And the beauty, the artist, what does he give society? He gives society great beauty, which enhances the life for the rest of us.
This principle of giving back seems to be a noble one and a good one, but the moment at which it, in some sense, becomes legal, there's no stopping, there's no way to stop that from becoming a kind of tyranny. So we're stuck in some way with the possibility that those who have more talent will use it, could use it unjustly, and a situation where the only way to equalize this by government force rather than moral persuasion leads to exactly where this ends up. A government that begins dividing parts of the soul and distributing them. It's kind of a frightening alternative.
It occurs to me that the place that you see the American appreciation of excellence most clearly is the appreciation of sports. No one wants a team that doesn't win, and no one will cheer for a team that doesn't win. But if you ever listen to any of the talk radio shows about sports, people call in, and though they themselves cannot do it, it doesn't produce envy of the great athlete that can do it, but they all pride themselves in becoming experts in baseball or in basketball.
Even the non-excellent benefit from excellence by identifying with it and
making themselves authorities of one form or another.
yeah, or vicariously participating
Yeah.
in the triumphs. That's true, but that's not the same thing as a kind of force of service. That's closer to, I think, Diana's point, that let people be excellent and everybody else will be benefited, will benefit from it. I mean, it's in a way the correlation between genius and taste, right? Very few Mozarts, one Mozart, but everybody who appreciates Mozart is in some way linked to that genius by virtue of showing a taste for it. And the gap between the great and the mediocre is bridged by appreciation. And we see that a lot to the extent to which we like excellence.
Let's get back to Vonnegut a little bit now, since we wandered away. What, without going into too much into his psyche or anything like that, what do you see as his point in writing this story?
I did come across a little quote from Vonnegut where he indicated that the feelings that he put himself in touch with while he wrote this story were the feelings that he himself experienced as a boy in high school. And he was not part of the in crowd. So in other words, as a young person, he was very aware of these feelings of envy and really tapped into what might motivate both Hazel and Diana Moon Glampers. It seems to me, though, then that also as an adult he must have gained some sort of perspective on those feelings, and so that he really is writing a kind of dystopia. What political order would look like when motivated by envy.
If we take his socialism seriously, he's trying to show you that a socialist dystopia or a socialist society would not necessarily look this ridiculous.
Right, because socialism would be motivated by some understanding of social justice.
Exactly.
And I don't actually see much of a real concern for social justice here. It does seem to be just this hatred of excellence.
Sometimes authors write a story with one intention and the story that they produce gets away from that intention. I don't think anybody reading the story today would say, here's Vonnegut caricaturing those people who say this is what socialism will look like, boys. That's what you people think, that's not socialism. But that's not the story we have, in a way. I mean, the story we have shows how the love of equality destroys all possible human excellence and produces souls without aspiration or longing, no love, absolutely dehumanized people, as Amy said. And I think that's the story he's produced, and it should be chastening for us lovers of equality in whatever degree to wonder about whether the praise of equality in this day and age wouldn't, in a way, lead us to countenance this unless we were careful.
Another way you could approach this, one thing we didn't mention, this is a TV-addicted society. So if you keep that in mind, this could be read as a kind of cautionary tale. America has become more and more TV-addicted since 1961. And that produces a kind of deadening, a kind of weighing down. And in that sense, maybe he has in mind some kind of cautionary tale with respect to that. If you're going to become addicted to TV, you're going to get desensitized human beings whose attention span is 20 seconds.
Yeah, I was
Yes,
just,
go ahead.
I mean, I didn't quite know where to put this in, but it might be worth pointing out that the handicapper general doesn't actually succeed in establishing equality. Everybody knows that those with the ugliest masks are the most beautiful people, or those carrying the most birdshot are the strongest people. So in other words, the extent of the handicap reveals the extent of the human excellence. And that again brings me back to the notion that this is not really equality, but or it's equality as fueled by envy, so that the point is almost as much to humiliate the excellent as to equalize them. So it does seem to me like an adolescent revenge fantasy, you know, that and then a kind of, you know, here's the disaster that would result if you actually acted upon that passion.
Would we feel as badly about this society if they chose to equalize the people by bringing the bottom up rather than bringing the top down?
What if we leveled up in a very benign way? Instead of manipulating genes, just alter the food supply or recommend a certain kind of diet for all pregnant women so that the next generation through diet will have all the benefits of intelligence and brawn and so on.
You know, some people are born with wonderful teeth and don't get cavities. But we now fluoridate the water so that everybody can have teeth that get fewer cavities. That's small change compared to the things that are talked about here. Let's assume you really could lift up without coercive means. Do we have objections to equalization of talents as such? Do we like the fact that some people are really vastly more gifted than others? Or would you like a world in which everybody starts not only on a level playing field, but with the same internal equipment, and then you'll find out what they'll make of themselves? And the internal equipment includes, by the way, not just smarts, but drive and desire and will and those sorts of things which make a telling difference with respect to the result.
I mean, this brings us to the point where we're asking, is there such a thing as nature? Some limit but beyond which, even if we wished, couldn't happen without changing nature.
Yeah.
And it does seem to me that nature gives us these differences, or at least some of them, which can't be ever eradicated. And that to alter this is might be a hope that someone has in a fantasy, but which would fundamentally change everything we know about human beings and society and the world we've come to know. It's almost a vain exercise to speculate. If I had to choose, I'd say no. I prefer to keep the world we live in than that. But I don't think we'll ever have that choice entirely.
My sense is if you leveled up, we would run into the same problems that we have. And you would very likely run into many of the same problems that exist here. Because you're not going to eliminate luck.
And you're not going to eliminate
without
envy.
doing exactly what Jim was suggesting, really transforming human nature altogether.
Well,
and then you're going to end up with inequalities.
right. Actually, I mean, this reminds me that something that hasn't really been stressed, and that has to do with, I mean, George says, if everybody stopped obeying the law, then we'd be back in the dark ages of competition. And there are parts of American society where competition is a dirty word, though for the most part it's still celebrated and encouraged. Can one have real excellence if one doesn't have competition? Or is the desire to eliminate competition in a world that produces losers of the sort that, for example, you might now see in soccer camp, where every kid gets a trophy, and we sort of play down the distinctions between those who are really good and those who are not. No games in which anybody comes home feeling that they've lost. can one mute competition and still have excellence, or do these things go together?
You know, excellence in some way, or an honor, are only defined by virtue of being excellent in relationship to others. When all are excellence, it's no longer excellence. So the scarcity is actually being better than others. And that's why this money thing is different. I think we take money rather than excellence because the money can be taken and moved around. You can take from the rich, but you can't take excellence without removing what it is.
But those who aim at excellence, if you want to be a great writer, it doesn't seem to me that a person like that understands himself always in competition with others.
Right.
You're defining yourself against the aspiration itself, or your own human possibilities. So, yeah, in general, a culture of competition contributes to excellence, but it may not be the best form of excellence. In other words, it's a kind of excellence that's driven by these comparative passions rather than by the love of beauty or something that draws one upward.
Yeah. Courage wouldn't cease to be courage if everybody had it equally. In other words, I would say it's more than just intellectual things in which there is a kind of standard of excellence which doesn't presuppose comparison. Although excellence being rare, as life goes, it often looks as if it depends upon some other people not making it.
Theoretically, intellectual excellence is utterly shareable, right? The more I know, the more you will know.
Because the things of the mind are not owned.
Exactly.
Intellectual property, to the contrary, notwithstanding.
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
If we were to try and take something away from this story, what would you try and take away from this, if this is a cautionary tale for the kind of education that students should have today in the principles of their society?
Avoid the politics of envy and spend more time with the founders. That's it.
Well, I would say one needs a much more careful consideration of the idea of equality. What we really are interested in, it seems to me, or ought to be interested in, beyond equality of rights and equality before the law and equality of opportunity, is not equality, but sufficiency. In other words, it seems to me that Americans ought to care that there be safety nets for people who are badly off through no fault of their own. We ought to have a certain concern for the well-being of all of our fellow citizens. But it shouldn't be discussed primarily, it seems to me, in terms of inequality, but it should be talked about in terms of providing the wherewithal for a decent life. The fact that there should be inequalities on top of that should be of, it seems to me, relatively little concern, whether it be of wealth or accomplishment. And it seems to me it's a grave mistake to talk about these things in terms of equality and inequality, because that only feeds this kind of insatiable desire for leveling, and an insatiable willingness to have the government intrude, to take away freedom to produce these factitious kinds of equality.
I would say in addition that you would cherish freedom. Freedom is obviously missing here. Government has become very intrusive, and government has become very intrusive precisely because they're trying to level the ground. Or, if you follow Leon's argument, eliminate the playing field altogether. No winners, no losers, and so on. I would read it as a cautionary tale, and it makes you think very seriously about how much government you want intruding in your life. On the one hand, and on the other hand, think more seriously about the freedoms that we have.
It seems to me one needs a kind of full-throated defense of real excellence without embarrassment. It can be done in a way in which it can gain, I think, the admiration and respect of of a larger group of people than is now thought possible. Just as there is respect for real excellence in sports, we could in a way encourage genuine excellence in these other areas and not be embarrassed by it.
Well, I'd like to thank our participants in the discussion today, Diana, Leon, and Amy, and I'd also like to thank our audience for watching this today.